Mayor of the City of Greater Bendigo, Councillor Margaret O'Rourke, Minister Jala Pulford, 2020 BIIF Chairman Paul Chapman and the Executive Committee, festival partners and of course you, our virtual community. Welcome. Welcome to the 10th Bendigo Invention and Innovation Festival. I'm Jonathan Ridnell. We have an amazing cross-section of business and manufacturing leaders, thinkers, academics and doers joining us during our 5-week festival. With over 80 speakers across 40 sessions, we hope you gain ideas, skills and tools to make innovation and change happen. We're so pleased the festival continues to grow. Optimism must be contagious. But I wonder whether we have misnamed our festival. With our move online, we have a truly international flavour with registrations from Europe, North America, Asia and the Middle East. I'd like to recognise where you're from and where you're joining us for the Bendigo International Invention and Invention Festival. To warm up our technology, I'd love to hear from you now. On your screens, you should have an Ask button. Right now, type in your name and where you're joining us from, whether you are a kilometre away in central Bendigo or thousands of kilometres away in the US. I'd love to see your names. So use your Ask question or your Ask button to ask questions right through the presentations. I'll do my best to make sure your voice is heard as part of the 2020 Bendigo Invention and Innovation Festival. In this session, we're showcasing an optimistic future for Greater Bendigo, which is made possible by our session partner, ASQ, and our contributors, Arup, Bendigo and Adelaide Bank, SGS Economics, and the Centre for Optimism. Today, we have 2 extraordinary opportunities to hear from a panel and a keynote speaker expanding on our theme, Optimism through Innovation. We'll meet perpetual optimist, Victor Perton, and a panel of speakers talking about how important it is to add optimism to the list of ingredients for a regional city's successful future. And this afternoon, you'll have the chance to hear from 2 optimists, one about Australia and regional Australia's place in the new space age, and how innovation is a key ingredient in the future of regional Australia. So send me the shout out via your screen. I'm really looking forward to meeting you all. But we have to make the 2020 BIIF official. So please welcome 3 people to open proceedings. Rodney Carter, a traditional owner and Chief Executive Officer of the Dja Dja Wurrung Clan's Aboriginal Corporation. The Honourable Jala Pulford, the appropriately titled Minister for Employment, Innovation, Medical Research and the Digital Economy and Minister for Small Business. And finally, the Chairman of our festival, Paul Chapman. Thank you, Rodney.
Benjen and Jandak. Benjen Wuminjika. Lerek Dja Dja Wurrung Kundicha. Munjaneak Mang Yara Moropok. Dalka Moropok. I'm very proud of my language to be able to welcome you to the Bendigo Invention and Innovation Festival. When newcomers come to the land of the Dja Dja Wurrung, my ancestors didn't realise how their world would change. We're excited to support the festival as we want others to be creative and use the challenges before us to come up with solutions for a prosperous future for future generations. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all placed and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Thank you so much for the opportunity to welcome you for the beginning of the 10th Bendigo Invention and Innovation Festival. 2020 has been an incredibly difficult year and we've all been challenged in ways we could never have imagined barely more than 6 months ago. And our recovery from this pandemic is going to need every bit of invention and innovation we can muster. Events like this festival are the perfect incubator, bringing people together to share innovations, inventions and ideas. I think we can be confident that good things will follow from that. Bendigo is a really important service and infrastructure centre for North Central Victoria. probably appropriate to give you my Central Victorian cred. I'm a Castlemaine girl who finished schooling at Bendigo High. And so it's a place that I certainly hold deeply in my heart. My parents are just down the road in Trentham to this day, and many a fond memory and a really important sort of formative life experience was had in and around Bendigo. But also over the years through my work in different roles, I have certainly come to know that Bendigo is a thriving and dynamic city, that we have a culture of entrepreneurship and creativity among our business community. There's an amazing ecosystem, and it's also Victoria's third largest economy. So you all have very good reason to be invested, not just in the local economy and its recovery, but also the statewide picture. I'm really proud that our government is supporting this festival for Bendigo. It's a fantastic program of activities focusing on innovation and tech, opportunities in manufacturing, education, and providing the really practical tools like skills and strategies for startups and small businesses. And the theme this year is perfect for the times: optimism through innovation. I certainly know Victor's been talking about optimism to everyone he can find. I think it's a great thing, the optimism movement, and in a year like this, we need to take whatever optimism we can find and embrace it warmly. Bendigo Innovation Festival is again taking place during the Victorian Government's statewide Digital Innovation Festival. The 2-week Digital Innovation Festival brings people together from across Victoria, engaging every sector of the community, every part of the economy that you can imagine, around technology and innovation. And it's so exciting. It's such a great program. And the entire thing is this year, like so many things, entirely online, which means that the things you might not have been able to get to last year, you'll be able to get to this year. Never been more important for us to be creative and have a go. So thank you so much for the opportunity to give you a few words of warm welcome. We're joined by many distinguished guests as well who will address you throughout the course of the festival, and for those community organisation and business leaders across Bendigo, we thank you for your support and collaboration and partnership in the delivery of this great festival of invention and innovation and ideas. Thanks. Have a great time.
Good morning. Minister Pulford, Minister for Innovation, Mayor O'Rourke, sponsors, speakers, presenters, visitors. Welcome to Bendigo and welcome to the 2020 Bendigo Invention and Innovation Festival. It's great to have you here. This year's festival theme is optimism through innovation, and we couldn't put this festival on without our sponsors. And I'd like to acknowledge all of those companies first, including the Greater City of Bendigo, Victorian Government Digital Innovation Festival, the Goldfields Local Learning and Education Network, NBN, Telstra, the Bendigo Tech School, the wonderful Centre for Optimism, the Bendigo Manufacturing Group, and a number of our session sponsors from that Bendigo Manufacturing Group. I thank you from my bottom of my heart for supporting us in this event. It's an extraordinary, unique time this time around because of, obviously because of COVID, where our event is now going online. As I mentioned, the event is themed Optimism through Innovation. And our wish for is to deliver a great sense of realistic optimism through speakers and presenters, the likes that Bendigo's never seen collected in one area before, from industry, from science, from education, innovators themselves, business leaders, agri-foods, every pertinent business in around the Bendigo region and indeed Australia-wide. I hope and we wish that people enjoy, learn, are inspired, are enthused and are energised from what they're going to experience over the next few weeks through this festival. Welcome. We embrace you. We embrace everything about the festival. And as in the classics they would say, let the show begin.
Thank you, Paul, and Minister Jala Pulford, and thank you for welcoming us to Dja Dja Wurrung country, Rodney Carter. And Rodney will be presenting as part of the festival on Thursday, sharing the Dja Dja Wurrung story of bringing Indigenous agriculture and aquaculture back to the Bendigo region. Well, I should be pleased, 25 shout-outs, but that means there's 375 of you who haven't said hello yet, so don't forget to use the Ask button on the side of your computer screen. Hello from Margot Rourke, I think that's the Mayor, saying hi from beautiful Bendigo. Let's go international, Monique in London, good morning, good evening where you are. Andrew Queck from Bendigo, hello and what a great start to BIIF 2020. Janae says hi from Bendigo. Dave Hughes says, hi from Bendigo. Good on you, Dave. And Guy says, who's looking forward to spring tomorrow? Good on you, Guy. Lorraine's from Melbourne. Peter's saying hello from San Francisco. And we've got April saying hello from Denver, Colorado. We've got Alison also from beautiful Bendigo. So to all of you, thank you so much for coming through and saying what we say in Australia, g'day. As I mentioned, this is the 10th Bendigo Invention and Innovation Festival. And because we are broadcasting around the globe, the festival already feels international. And like every international festival, I think we need to make sure that the whole world notices. So can you do something else for me, please? If you are a Twitter user, I'd like you to post 5 tweets today and use the hashtag 2020BIIF. That's hashtag 2020BIIF and share your thoughts about our festival around the world. Whew, right, we've officially launched the 10th Bendigo Invention and Innovation Festival. We know that you are watching from maybe your office, your home office. Perhaps you're struggling with the homeschoolers on your kitchen table, and we know we are having an inspiring, innovative and inventive panel of speakers to meet right now. You're watching through the World Wide Web, and through your website, you can find detailed biographies of our first 3 speakers. Well, in brief, Marnie Baker isn't just the Managing Director of Bendigo and Adelaide Bank, she's the role model of those people who start their careers on the shop floor and aspire to a fulfilling career in the organisation they joined. Marnie has been part of the bank since 1989 and Managing Director since 2018. Marnie is not only a proud part of the bank, she's also a proud Bendigonian. So Marnie, welcome to the festival.
Thanks, Jonathan. Lovely to be here.
Patrick Fensham has been looking to the future for most of his career. As a principal and partner at SGS Economics and Planning, Pat has worked across Australia and overseas, developing a concept that we probably don't talk about enough, community wealth building. Pat, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Jonathan. Lovely to be here.
And third in our group to discuss an optimistic future for Greater Bendigo is Tim Williams. Dr. Williams is the principal at global advisory firm Arup and brings to his role as head of cities for Arup's Australasian cities a wealth of experience and success. He's been head of the Committee of Sydney, and before that, he took up that role in 2011, and before that, Tim played key roles in developing the East End of London, making sure the 2012 Olympics were held in the UK, and spent 15 years advising 5 consecutive British ministers on urban planning. Tim, welcome to the BIIF.
Thank you for inviting me. I bring you greetings from Manly.
From Manly. Watch for the ferry and the jetty landing. As you watch our panel today, remember you can add a question to the conversation simply by using the Ask function on your screen. I look forward to asking questions on your behalf in about 45 minutes. Well, our panel is confronting the issues that our local and state governments and communities are dealing with right now. And in Bendigo, that's a growing population. Bendigo will grow from around 118 to 140,000 people in the next 10 years. So economic forecasts social implications of the rapid growth, and of course the spectre of rebuilding a damaged economy after the COVID pandemic means many pearls and any pearls of wisdom from our panel will be gratefully accepted. So Tim, can I start with you? How can you be optimistic about a future when everything is so uncertain?
I think it's out of evil cometh good. I'm from a Welsh Protestant background, good biblical learning. But I think also that word innovation used to alienate people, and now we're doing it every day of our lives, all of us. So I think it's a kind of interesting moment where solutions are going to come not just from the usual suspects, but everybody's conspiring to think of the new. And I think there are a number of opportunities. It's interesting. Necessity is the mother of invention after all. And I think where we're at is that a number of things that we thought were set in concrete, not all of them good, we're now thinking through. So COVID is a moment of not just some of us desperately want to restart stuff, but we also need to rethink stuff. And I think there are a number of dimensions of kind of optimism. I think one is around spatial. I think there is at the one hand a crisis of the urban. A number of people are challenging whether high-density cities of the future, where 6 months ago we weren't questioning that. And I think we're now looking at whether there are alternatives in regional cities. I think this is a moment for regional cities to step up and see what their offer is. There's also a kind of industrial innovation inevitably coming through the disruption of supply chains internationally, and that plays very well, I think, to the kind of local tradition in Bendigo. So if you bring those two things together, a kind of possibility that it's the moment for the growth of the kind of public health-driven regional city, the genuinely smart city like Bendigo can be, combined with a kind of industrial opportunity, I think there is a source of optimism, actually, and particularly for a kind of place like Bendigo.
Okay, so good news not just for Bendigo, but for any regional centre that has infrastructure to welcome new people.
Can I just say one thing about that? So it's funny, the word optimism is great in this context. Optimism must not be understood as waiting for the phone to ring. I think it's about making the call yourself. And I think that essentially the opportunity is like the door is opened for that industrial opportunity, that innovation economically, and that spatial innovation. But that it's still down to places to really compete by collaborating together and getting out there to say what their strengths are, but what else they might need to become what we need going forward. And I think I'd like to see governance innovation, if you like. So and the last point about that, I think what's great about a place like Bendigo, and it really is, having worked in a number of Australian cities, I mean, Sydney is quite difficult to bring together. So I think that a place like Bendigo, its unique selling point must be its public-private collaboration. And I think if you bring all that together, you can pick up the phone and get investment and talent to come.
It's interesting you should say that. In Bendigo, one of our business leaders said you can get 25 people in a room and you can get every strata of Bendigo represented. So that idea of people knowing each other seems to be really important.
It's a selling point.
Okay, interesting indeed. The last 12 months has seen some tremendous adapting and some extraordinary innovations by Australians. We keep saying manufacturing in a centre like Bendigo is doing well, in fact better than some other sectors. Can you comment on whether Bendigo and regional Australia should be optimistic?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, it's partly because I think there is that what was happening before COVID was the advent of the fourth industrial revolution of the kind of knowledge economy. But I think what I was always worried about with the knowledge economy, it sounds like offices again. And actually, there's more to an economy than that. And a place like Bendigo still has the skills, still has the tradition to, I think, exploit that a lot more. But I do think that there is a kind of need to bring that tradition together with a kind of modern university sector. And you've got it burgeoning. I think the future of TAFE needs to be thought through. But I think it's one of those moments where if you bring that kind of collaborative feel, that spatial opportunity, the disruption of supply chains, or some of the things we thought were inevitably always going to be made in China going forward, that isn't the case. And but I end where I started, which is that the door is opened, but it's not the same as like mixing my metaphors, to close the deal. The opportunity is there. But, what are the other things we need to think about in this sort of economic piece, right? I think it is an opportunity to think about the kind of, without in any way being controversial about it, the zero economy zero poverty kind of agenda. We now know we didn't really like the way the cities were going, to be honest. I mean, they were getting very places which only rich people could afford to live, right? So there's an opportunity for us to use this kind of new momentum, I think, new pattern potentially of development of Australia, but combine it, I think, with some critical economic agendas. But it still requires one thing, I think, of all of us, that we become a real learning society and not be complacent about our schools and our universities, so that, it sounds like a big agenda, but it's a big moment, And I think we need to, the last thing is everybody tells me to be realistic and pragmatic, and I agree. But in 1968 in Paris, there was a great slogan on the wall, it was "Be realistic, demand the impossible." And I think that we're at a moment where we just have to think things we didn't think were thinkable are happening. So what else do you want to do?
Revert back to being a 3-year-old where you ask why not rather than why. Interesting stuff. Pat, you would like to expand on that idea as well.
Yeah, look, I in relation to manufacturing, Bendigo, and I've looked at the stats, it's shown remarkable resilience over 20 or 30 years, given the decline generally in manufacturing in Australia, particularly in manufacturing employment. So Bendigo's been a beacon of success in some ways. It has had its own declines in employment, but it's still a very significant part of the economy. And I think that does get to some of the things that we've been talking about, which is the nature of those community connections, the history, the resilience of the sector there. But in general, I think Australia, we've shown flexibility during COVID. We've pivoted to new markets. We've responded to some extent, but in general, I think there's a way to go. And I think it's often suggested we're sort of healthy at the advanced end of the spectrum, advanced manufacturing, but that the production has gone offshore. But I still look sometimes at some products. I remember seeing Swedish matches or French glasses. So there are things that are made in modern industrial economies which are still made there. So it is interesting to think what space there is for us to more advance into that sector. And I agree with Tim around the sort of infrastructure and education around manufacturing. We do need, I think, nationally to take it more seriously. We think that industry policy, it's got a bad name, industry policy, that it's, that sort of somehow it's anti-competitive, or, we're not letting the market do its thing, or we're picking winners. Well, we pick winners all the time by subsidising fossil fuels. We pick winners actually by subsidising solar panels and renewables. We subsidise house building like it's going out of fashion. So It's not like manufacturing's looking for a subsidy. It needs a framework and a structure which will enable it to flourish. So there's a lot of work to be done. I've got great optimism around Bendigo just because I think it's great and it'll always find a way, but it could go to the next level with more support.
So can I just say, I think that's really important, Pat's last point about that we mustn't sort of delude ourselves with the actuality of the successful economies on the planet all had public-private collaboration.
Yeah.
It's completely always been a myth. They all had industrial policies. And it's forced upon us now to actually put aside ideology and to actually think through what a clever government looks like in working with the private sector.
So just one more point on that, Tim. Sorry, Jonathan, I know you want to move on. When we have our big train contracts, and I looked at this last night, the last big round of buying trains in New South Wales was Australia or New South Wales buying trains from China. Now, who thinks that the Chinese don't have an industry policy supporting manufacturing there? So, we've got to get our perspective right. And as Tim says, public-private partnerships and collaboration important.
A bit later in the conversation, I want to pick up on a phrase you used, Tim, competitive cooperation. But before we do that, I'd love to bring Marnie Baker into the conversation because I suppose you have looked at developing banking as a service across metropolitan, suburban and regional Australia. And so you perhaps can stand back and say, well, when your advisors are telling you about livability, Bendigo's livability and its selling points, are we punching above our weight or about average for a good regional centre?
Oh, Jonathan, I'm a proud regional Australian. I'm a proud regional Victorian, and I'm even prouder Bendigo. So you're speaking to the right person. Tim touched on it before, just how connected this community is. The fact that we've got, local government, business in both private and public sectors, the community, all coming together for the common purpose, I think really puts Bendigo, ahead of most cities in Australia. We're a city that's just full of knowledge and experience. A thriving place. If you think of our heritage and going back to the gold rush, we're also a culturally diverse and enriched city as well. There's a lot of German architecture that comes from the gold rush sort of times. The Chinese that came out, as part of the gold rush. So it's a very inclusive city as well. Like I said, vibrant. We're often termed the city in the forest because we are surrounded by bush, but we have large open spaces. Affordable housing. I think we've been designated internationally as Australia's first city of gastronomy. Food. We are very well known for our food. Again, I think Tim spoke about it before. For our education, we are a university city, and we have TAFEs, great sporting facilities, access to public transport. We're not far from Melbourne. We're not far from the snow. We're not far from the beaches. In my mind, I think we're a perfect city.
And it's probably faster to get to the international airport from Bendigo than some parts of Melbourne. So, all right, Marnie Baker, who's not just the Managing Director of Bendigo and Adelaide Bank, but also Ambassador for Bendigo. Thank you for that answer. I suppose that thing too, Bendigo Bank has got branches and offices in Melbourne, other regional centres across Australia. What's the conversation going inside the bank? Are you getting staff now saying, we'd rather be working from Bendigo now, please, rather than we want to move to South Bank?
I think the conversation is between those more populated areas and probably less populated areas. So if I think about the cities, versus regional areas, and now that people have sort of figured out that you can actually work remotely, you can work from wherever you happen to set your laptop up or your phone or whatever it may be. Is that now people are thinking more about, well, where do I actually want to live? I don't have to live where my office happens to be located anymore. I can actually live where I love. And I know it's something that I've said a few times of more recent times, but the secret really is out that, regional areas, and Bendigo's a great example of that, are just wonderful places to live, raise your family and work.
It's funny, isn't it? Live where you love, but does that also, and this can be to the panel, also love where you live? So do you find that if you are more content in the community that you're in, you're more likely to be volunteering for something or actively involved with your community?
I think absolutely, and I think that goes to the connection that we were talking about, within this great city, is because people actually do love where they live. And I'm really fortunate in a sense that, being a part of an organisation that's 162 years, the only major bank that's actually housed outside of a capital city. And we are just proof that you can actually run an ASX, top 100 ASX listed company outside of a capital city in a regional area, in a thriving and vibrant regional area.
Terrific. Tim?
Yeah, I was going to say that I think the opportunity of home working is a very important one, particularly for regional cities, and I don't doubt it. And you can see, and I would guess, it's a fool's guess, but perhaps 30%, 40% of workers over time will not be going back to the cities. That's a challenge for the CBD of Melbourne, and we have to think about all these things. But I think there is an opportunity. However, I think there's also an opportunity for an employer to devolve your work not to Bendigo but to Bangalore, right? So i.e., we've got to find some way of providing an added reason as to why Bendigo, if you're going to leave Melbourne. And I think this You need to curate and actively intervene in the ecosystem for innovation in Bendigo. I.e., don't assume automatically it's just about individualized workers, in front of their screens, just happening to live in Bendigo. What else are you going to do? What else are you going to do to connect them up locally, to make sure that there is kind of sparks of innovation between them locally? And I think there's all sorts of things around, great co-working spaces, public sector being very innovative around procurement to encourage local prototyping of projects. What's going to be the buzz, not just urban design livability, but the economic curation of activity in Bendigo to actually make it a different place to go to.
And Pat, you also wanted to expand on that.
Yeah, look, I think Bendigo and other regional centres in Australia have great livability, and they've got that great community resource and support, but it's not like it doesn't wither, and we've seen, I think, and Tim could regale us with examples from Britain where austerity has ripped the heart out of communities, so communities, just like we invest in our infrastructure, in our people, in terms of education, so we think about those inputs to businesses, but we don't often think about the community as an input in itself. And it probably preempts maybe some of the chat we'll get to later, but we've recircled back to this idea, and we've spent a lot of time already talking about community, but it is a distinct, and in the language of economists, competitive advantage for Bendigo and for some regional parts of Australia, but it doesn't happen by accident. It continues there's a continual need to nurture it, and something that I've written about and that SGS has talked about is the idea of a community infrastructure guarantee. I think we need to know what is the baseline of community assets and community infrastructure that keeps that community as an important part of the economy and the society. Interesting
indeed. And Marnie, you'd like to expand also on this conversation about community?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really important, the infrastructure that you have in your community, and that's not only, by way of services. And, Bendigo's a great example. Again, I'll give a few plugs through this, but, we've got the biggest and I think the best equipped hospital in regional Victoria. So we've got great services, and like I said, in education services. But there's a lot of the time communities will look to government, whether that be state, federal, or even local government, to be funding a lot of, the infrastructure, social and economic infrastructure that's required. The communities themselves, and I think this is something through our organisation, and our community bank model that's now over 20 years old, was actually empowering communities to actually reach their own sort of destinies and to be able to be self-sustainable without having the need to always be drawing down on government funding. And, and I think it's that cohesion and that community cohesion that can really accelerate your city, your region, your town.
Okay, so Marnie Baker, I'd like to also throw at you, because managing director of a national, as you say, ASX top 100 company, also a local Bendigo person, so you get roped into things like sitting on the Greater Bendigo Economic Development Strategy working group. I'm not sure how many other national MDs get to sit on their local economic development plans, but it says that idea that, as you've all been touching on, we need to recognise that the city can do better in including everyone in education, everyone in employment opportunities. So what solutions should Bendigo and its supporters consider to make sure that Bendigo's boom is not just about skilled workers migrating to the region, but also giving a leg up to perhaps those parts of the community who've missed out so far?
Yeah, and that's really important, because we cannot have the divide. And, you're seeing it in a social sense, you're seeing it in a digital sense with the, the acceleration through COVID of the digital technologies too. But one interesting statistic, Jonathan, is that, there's usually larger numbers of unemployment or percentage of unemployment in regional areas, but there's also a larger number of job vacancies in regional Australia, which doesn't, so something's amiss there. And I think there's a lot to be said around that mismatch of skills and jobs. We spend a lot of time talking about, gaining skills and university degrees, and, everything seems to be 2, 3, 4, 5 years to gain skills. This is about actually micro-skilling people. It's about ensuring that, as you are actually coming out of school at whatever level that is, or whether you're coming back into the workforce, that you're able to actually gain immediate skills that are going to be needed by the industries and businesses, within your local community. And I think there's more that we can do on a micro level to get that match of skills with jobs, because the jobs, the data does tell you that the jobs are there. So we just need to be matching better.
Excellent. Okay, well, you've been listening to the first half hour of the Bendigo Invention and Innovation Festival. Our panellists today talking about Bendigo as a terrific example of a strong city with a positive future. And in the last 25 minutes, people have been communicating with us using the Ask a Question option to the right of your screen. For example, Tim says, I moved to regional Victoria, that's Wodonga, in 2004, due to the greater sense of local community. Public and private collaboration is excellent, and it's a great point to raise. The question I have, though, is how can we move from public-private opportunity to real outcomes? So I guess that we hear a lot about major infrastructure in, say, Melbourne or on highways being a public-private kind of a relationship, but, can we do better? And I might throw that to you initially, Tim.
Yeah, I think one of the things we can do is funny. Innovation is a word that shouldn't just be limited to technology and industry. We need to see some governance innovation as well. And one of the things, Pat will know I obsess about these matters, but there is a thing around the way in which governments allocate money for infrastructure projects. They tend to always be won by the bigger cities. The competition is not a level playing field because it always was about bang for the public buck, rather than can we use this investment to restructure our regions, as it were, to reinvest in them, and can they get a priority going forward? Because what we want to do is make them flourish so that we don't put them in the same competition as Melbourne. We give them their own competition, as it were. So I think there's something around governance innovation. So I think that's right. This thing about public-private collaboration is a necessary but not sufficient, is because it needs some investment to work on. I think the second thing is around in procurement innovation in the regions itself. You'd be surprised, but I don't know what the number would be in Bendigo, but quite a large proportion of public money actually seeps out of regional economies through actually people buying services from consultancies like myself. Instead of developing local capacity a bit more, I'd like to see a little bit more of the kind of public money spent in the region to develop a local capacity. And I think the last thing is but there's an Australian moment here, which I think it might take a Welshman living in Manly to point out from time to time, but essentially, more people have died in the London borough of Hackney, I think it is, maybe 2 London boroughs, than Australia overall. That is in 2 places which add up to about 500,000 people. More people have died. Australia has done very, very well. The optimism we need from that, by the way, is that we've survived this thing really quite well, but we mustn't be complacent about the economic consequences of it.
Yep. So, Tim, I might move over to Pat, who's been raising his hand for a few moments, and I'm going to preempt you with a bit of a question, which is that optimism should also mean about optimistic for the future of everybody. I'll go back to that competitive cooperation. So a national or a state organisation moving to Bendigo saying, but we'll still use our lawyer in Melbourne, we'll still use our procurement process through our supplier in Melbourne, isn't really getting the best benefit for a regional centre, is it, Pat?
No, it isn't. And this agenda which Tim's mentioned, and I'll pivot back to what I was going to say, but I can respond to the direct question. This agenda around procurement favouring local economies is a really, really critical one. And it's been a big part of the community wealth building movement in Britain, for example, and there's some great examples from there. But the point is you sometimes get a pushback from maybe the neoliberals or the mainstream economists who say, isn't that municipal protectionism? This is, well, actually, no, it's about oiling the wheels of a good competitive economy. So if your procurement contracts are arranged in a way that enables greater competition amongst the local small business sector, then you're actually providing a basis for a more competitive economy, more opportunities for new entrants into that economy. Whereas if the procurement is always structured so that it favours the big end of town, or that favours the big firms that can only compete out of Melbourne or out of Sydney or even globally, then you're actually stuck in an extractive economy, which is a concentrated economy, a semi-monopolistic economy. So that is not the definition of a liberal economy. So that's something which is really important.
And Pat, I guess I'll just make a point of that. You don't see too many national procurement organisations sponsoring your local football team.
Yeah.
No, that's right, exactly right.
So
yes.
Now, Pat, you mentioned the word pivot the first time for the morning, so congratulations. You wanted to pivot back to the point you were making?
Look, I've sort of made it at the third point I was going to make in relation to procurement, but we're talking about, what action can we take in regions, and Tim's point about the big infrastructure decisions being made in cities that favour cities, well, that's because a lot of the decision makers are in those cities. That's because that's their lived experience, and it's because where the scale of opportunities are. So, a big road project in Melbourne can't compete with a minor bypass in country Victoria, or regional Victoria. But an aggregation of projects seen as one big project starts putting the potential for that to be on the map. So if you were to bundle up a whole range of projects which would benefit regional Victoria in a big way, or regional New South Wales in a big way, then you start being on a more level playing field to the single mega project that comes out of a capital city idea, for example. So that's an answer.
And so, Marnie, you have been champing at the bit to say something now.
I think that's a really good point that you've made there, Patrick, because the way that it is actually structured, the funding is structured now, is that you actually have to compete against each other. So in a regional sense, your towns and those that are next to you, you're actually competing against to get the same thing. So we do need to do more around collaborating and pooling our efforts together. And it goes right back to the start of what Tim said right at the start around Bendigo. That whole collaboration, that's the key to it here. We're talking about infrastructure and so forth, but another one is super funds. Super is a drain out of regional Australia. Now, there's a lot of regional Australians who would like to see their super funds invested back into.
And a frozen Marnie Baker from Bendigo and Adelaide Bank.
I'm
it's a
going to
good point. So, Tim, you can finish the sentence.
I'm going to finish Marnie's sentence for her intuitively. I think that's a brilliant point with that last point. And by the way, if you ever want to know what innovation in government looks like,
So, Tim, Marnie, sorry, we lost you there for a moment, so we'll come back to you with that. But Tim was just expanding on your whole point about innovation in government, was it?
Well, it's superannuation as an innovation in itself,
yeah.
but also paradoxically bringing some problems. It's one of the greatest things of any government has ever created, compulsory superannuation. Australia now is the fourth biggest pension fund pot of globally, when it's got 26 million people. It's an astonishing thing, but it also has slightly perverse consequences. What I was going to say was that the great concept of collaboration needs to be put alongside the even greater concept of the entrepreneurial state. That essentially we now need this. It's unavoidable. If there are ideologues out there who think government hasn't got a role in the economy, they're living in the wrong year. From this point on, maybe for the next decade, we're going to see high government intervention, public at state, federal, and local level, unavoidable. So it might as well be clever. It's not a big state or a small state, it's a smart state, right? And I think that what Bendigo needs to be is the poster child for the smart local state.
All right.
That's what it needs to be.
Tim, I might go now back to Marnie. Sorry, if you basically were finished on you starting to raise the issue of reinvestment of regional people's superannuation in regional areas, and we missed everything else since. So do you mind rewinding 30 seconds for us?
I think Tim's actually covered it off. It is the fact that there is a drain of funding and capital that actually does move into the capital cities and away from those regional areas. And I think a lot of regional Australians would like to see some of that reinvestment back into their local areas.
Right. We haven't heard from you for a little while, Pat, so maybe I can ask you a little bit about the idea that we are going through, I'm going to use the jargon, unprecedented times, but at the end of it, you're saying it's going to need a lot of effort to continue the momentum of change that we're seeing right now. Do you see that there are going to be some people saying it's time to go back to business as usual, rather than seeing this as a chance to really rethink how our communities and our industries work?
Well, I think Tim summed it up. I mean, the idea that we'll go back to a sort of a neoliberal view of the world, a small government, deregulation, it is not the time for that sort of thinking. So, I've been talking a lot about the community wealth building idea. It starts local, but it's scalable to the national sort of level. So the idea of rooting our economies in our communities, of ensuring that our supply chains are such that local businesses have an opportunity to compete. The idea of reinvesting our savings in our communities. Look, we've seen the expansion of ethical investment. People like to think that their money is doing something that's ethical and that it's environmentally sensitive. And as Marnie says, there's no reason why people wouldn't always also put their hand up to say, I'd like to see some of my savings invested in my progressive economy. So yeah, I think it isn't business as usual. We need to think. Government will have a big role, and we need to think about the structure of our economies and the types of businesses that we want to sustain our economy in future.
And Pat, that gives me the perfect question to ask you, because I was meant to ask it at the beginning, and that is wealth versus community wealth. What do you actually mean in this sector that you've been promoting? What's community wealth?
Australia is a wealthy country. The US is a wealthy country. There are a lot of wealthy countries that do well from the traditional measures of wealth. But typically, and more often, and more, it's concentrated in fewer hands. And in our cities, more concentrated in our cities than our regions, more concentrated amongst older people than younger people. So we're seeing concentrations and divisions emerging around the nature of our wealth. And so community wealth is what it sort of is described as. It's dispersed, it's rooted in and retained by and recirculated within local communities. And the term community wealth building has its origins in Ted Howard's Democracy Collaborative out of Cleveland in Ohio. I think it was talked about in the mid-2000s initially. And it's about wealth being controlled locally. So in co-ops, small businesses, employee-owned sector, etc. And because it's in local areas, it's more likely to be spent locally. So surplus is spent locally with a virtuous cycle around economic development and progressive economic development.
Is this also a pushback against the 1% that we keep hearing about, the idea that so much wealth is being accumulated by so few corporations or individuals?
It is exactly about that, but look, it's more than just a nice thing. I mean, it's actually about our very sustainability. Look at the dysfunction that the US is in at the moment, and the terrifying prospect that Donald Trump might get elected again. So the dysfunction of the US has its heart in these divisions around wealth. And so there's a real need for urgency around this community wealth building agenda, in my view.
So I might ask you, Tim, if we can, about whether or not there are examples in your experience of where community wealth building has been seen and been celebrated.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think, so one, I think is an absolutely vital agenda. Just to put it in context, which will please Pat, but it's true, is that just when we've all been going through some hell recently, the international stock markets have been doing very, very well. and they've been completely separated from the real economy. So if there isn't going to be a reckoning at this time, I'll sell my house. It's definitely going to be there's definitely a big political shift coming out of all this, and it's not a left and right thing. It's probably a kind of localist versus globalist thing in a quite an important way, which is that, as we heard, even down to the level of the superannuation funds, which Marnie makes a really important point. They've been leaving regional areas, and that can't be quite what we want. I mean, the example I always feel inspired by, especially because I come from a mining and industrial background, is in the Basque Country. For decades they've had Mondragon, which is a cooperative sector emerging, and I just think this whole idea of the kind of, on the one hand, the social economy, but the social economy doesn't mean that we just have to be soft and charitable. It's about using and understanding local skills and innovation and entrepreneurship, which I think comes back to the Bendigo agenda, because there's a kind of link with all these things, right? Some places haven't got the wherewithal to do the local innovation economy. I come from a part of the world, sadly, or delightfully, in almost all respects, a mining town in South Wales, which kind of peaked in 1921, and I'm not joking, it did, right? But Bendigo fell, but didn't fall that far. And I think it's got its university, it's got its kind of public-private collaboration, it's got its population growth, it's got its clever people, it's got this moment where people are looking to do something different. I think it could become an international, I do think this, beacon of what a medium-sized town that actually is not that far from a capital city, but it's got its own identity and its industrial tradition, can now do at this moment of thinking of new solutions to economic challenges, of including the community, of thinking of the green economy, of developing it locally, of what do we do with AV, what do we do with AI, what do we do to go towards a zero carbon economy in Bendigo, what do we do about the circular economy in Bendigo, right? So I think there's a moment where, and I'm not exaggerating this, I think there is such an opportunity for somebody to put their hands up and say, I think I've got some good ideas. Because I tell you, the people that were supposed to bring these ideas officially have failed internationally, and it's the moment of everybody else. So why can't Bendigo lead that?
Tim, good point. An innovation in Bendigo, I'm not sure how many years ago now, was via the Bendigo Bank, the community bank, the community enterprise. So Marnie, I suppose that we've heard a little bit about community wealth building in other places, but do you see that idea that Bendigonians and other people who bank with you are prepared to put a few crumbs of their return back into their communities to see stronger sports communities, stronger arts communities, stronger, skateboarding communities?
Oh, absolutely, Jonathan, and I'm sorry I dropped out. I've been working from home since March, and it's the first time I've ever dropped out, so apologies. It's Murphy's Law, isn't it?
It's because everyone's tuning into the BIIF and stealing our bandwidth.
Is that it? Yeah, no, absolutely. The community bank model that we pioneered over 20 years ago now is based very much around the premise of communities being self-sustainable. There is absolutely a community spirit, across Australia in regions, in towns, in rural, regional, and in metropolitan areas as well. And people do, there are champions in every community. We see that in every community who will step up and they will lead. They will lead their local community, and people do and will get behind their community if they have a say, if they're able to have a say in the decisions that are made, and they have a say in where investment is actually placed, and they get to actually utilise the fruits of those investments. So, like I said, it's a world-renowned community bank model, and it works. It absolutely works.
Marnie, I'm going to throw that into a question to you, Tim, and to Pat as well. And an example of perhaps a big change that regional Australia had happened around about 20 or 25 years ago. Bank branches disappeared from our country towns.
I was going to say,
and that definition of a community leader went from person in pinstripe suit to whoever had a good idea. And I think, that idea of community leadership is becoming bottom up rather than top down.
I think so, but I think there's also some hard elements to this, which Marnie kind of alluded to. It is really crucial to Bendigo that it kept its Bendigo Bank. It's really crucial. because as you were indicating, a lot of the decline of regional cities everywhere took the form of the middle classes and the financial services leaving that area, so that the relocation of finance, the relocalizing of the finance of some of this stuff is really important. It's almost the most important innovation, so that you've got some patriotic local money effectively circulating around the local economy. But I'm an optimist. I think this is why we're here. I think it's a moment where a lot of the traditional ideas are barriers. People saying, "Oh, you can't do that." I think that's gone. The people who tell us you can't do this didn't see this coming. So I just think I think we've got a moment where you've got the conditions coming together in Bendigo, but the ambition has to be right. I think the ambition is to be a leading town of this size internationally, leading the charge to renewal.
Excellent,
Jonathan. Imagine a reform around superannuation that was really focused on Central Victoria. Like this is here's a share of or a portion of our super money which is going to be set aside for Central Victoria. And again, the investment decisions that superannuation managers are making are often quite lazy. They're herd mentality stuff. So it's not like there aren't good projects and possibilities in Central Victoria that couldn't provide a competitive return for investors, but we're just not structured. It's just not structured in that way. So the ideas need to come, and super is an area ripe for reform to assist regional Australia.
I'll throw back to you a term I heard on the ABC, sorry to flog that, a bit earlier today, and that was regional narcissism. I'd not come across it. It was coined by a Norwegian researcher, and it was that idea that someone in a capital city does not see the value as much of a person in a regional or country centre. That idea that where I am is better than where you are, and I wonder whether or not everything that we're talking about, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's finance, whether it's community and infrastructure development, we still have to do that. Canberra is more important than Sydney. Sydney's more important than Melbourne. Melbourne's more important than Bendigo, for example. Is that actually something that enters the psyche of our decision makers?
It is, and the response to that, it needs to be carefully done, but we do need to think about a devolution agenda. Britain's gone there tentatively. Tim and I will recall some conversations we had about the Greater Metropolitan Authority in Sydney, the Greater Sydney Commission. So the idea of decisions being made at the right level for communities. So I would say we heard this Marnie talk about the skills gap in Bendigo before. Well, how well is education structured in Central Victoria, in the Bendigo region, to actually address that issue, or are those decisions being made out of Melbourne? So is that thinking out of Melbourne in the Central Department of Education appropriate to the nuance and the differences and the issues that are in Bendigo around skilling up the population? And it's a trades community. It's got a background in that sort of innovation, in manufacturing, in gold mining, of course, going back a long time, and it has its pockets of disadvantage and unemployment. How well structured and are the decisions being made about the future for people being made in the region? And that's the devolution agenda. It's actually real power and real meaningful decision-making for regional communities.
Excellent.
I think, Jonathan, sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. Please do.
I think there's a real naivety to that statement, and perhaps there's some awareness that we need to provide to our sort of city counterparts. 93% of all of the food here in Australia that we eat actually comes from the regions. 95% of small businesses are outside of the capital cities. Regional Australia contributes a significant amount to the economy of Australia. And there is a place for the city and there's a place for the region. And, we need to be actually working alongside each other to ensure that the whole of Australia is thriving, because especially in these current times, and as we move forward, to recover from COVID, we're going to need to be actually working together.
Couldn't agree more.
As a nation. Interesting and good point there, Marnie. We've been speaking for about 45 minutes and it's gone in a blink, I'm afraid. I certainly have some more questions I'd like to ask, but I've already been promoting that the Bendigo Invention and Innovation Festival is interactive. So, Marnie, would you mind taking maybe a question or two while we get the rest of our panel back online? And I wonder whether or not a question about optimism and innovation. Without optimism, passion and purpose, is there any real potential to thrive? So if that's what we're saying, as a community, what can we do to shift from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset? And I think that growth isn't necessarily about consumption.
No, it's not. It's being open to embracing new ideas, new industries, new ways of thinking and doing things. And I think it's a phrase that's been coined, of more recent years, this growth mindset. And I think it's a really positive phrase to have, because change is. Everyone talks about people don't like change. I think we've got a younger generation that are growing up now, and all they've ever known is change and quick change. It's just, it's by the minute change now, and they've adapted so much better than older generations to this quick change, and I think just automatically actually have more of a growth mindset than a fixed mindset. So I think we've got such an opportunity here, and which is why I love the Centre of Optimism. I love what Victor's doing there, because if I think about regional Australians, but I do think about Australians too, we are such a resilient, optimistic, adaptable, innovative country, and this is where we should thrive.
Interesting. And this one, gosh, I'm sorry to be asking in some ways this of a managing director of a national bank, but in some ways it has been a conversation, and that is the idea of the top 1% and the rest. Aaron says Thomas Piketty warns of the rise of the wages of super managers and the division of labour and its return on investment. And he also warns against that income equality worsening between that top 1 or 0.5% and the rest of us. Do you see that devaluing one group of people's time compared to another is actually something that needs to be addressed as we develop regional Australia?
Yeah, I think it absolutely does. This whole, not leaving anyone behind, even prior to COVID, there was a divide, and you could actually see that widening. And if you looked even from a wage perspective, and wages have been stagnant, but if you compare that to the New Start, and I was a big advocate for the fact that actually hadn't kept pace, with CPI, and we were getting more and more people that were falling below the poverty line. We are a rich country here, and we should be able to spread our wealth across the whole country, and we shouldn't be in a situation in a developed country like ours where people are left behind. And there is so much more that we can do at the very grassroots level in our communities to ensure that divide doesn't get any worse, and in fact that we actually improve things.
For sure. Now, I had another question, but the screen is moving. This is just like live radio. It's amazing. Anthony's got a good question, and Marnie, you're still my solo speaker, but health and well-being is also wealth. How are local policies going to gear towards both the mental and physical health and wealth of our communities?
Yeah, look, I think everyone's really cognizant of that, especially in the current times. Prior to COVID, we did a survey across our over 300 community banks and those communities right across Australia, and at the very top of the list was mental health for all of those communities. So it's something that from the country from Australia's perspective, something we really do need to focus on. You put things like the bushfires that we had, at the start of the year, and people tend to forget about those because COVID's become all-encompassing. But there was so much other tragedy that actually occurred and traumatic things for many Australians through the bushfires and droughts and even floods. Put COVID on top of that, and it is a real concern. And I know from the federal government through, there is a real focus on, how we actually do support, people who are going through tough times, and how do we actually get more assistance and support into those organisations, especially that are assisting, individuals in these times. So it's a big issue. It's a big issue for Australia, but one, again, that if we all come together and we collaborate on this, from communities right through to government, that we can make some good headway.
Good point and a good question. Thank you for that, Anthony. Oh no, it just flicked away. What was the question? It doesn't really matter. One thing, Marnie, which we haven't touched on, which I really wanted to, was another of Bendigo's advantages. We were founded on gold in 1851. It seems like gold 2.0 is here, with Fosterville to our north and Costerfield to our east, and lots of exploration licenses. Do you think we can do better at distributing the wealth of that kind of mineral exploration than we did back in 1850?
Yeah, look, we're very excited here in Bendigo because we are sitting on the cusp of yet another gold era. And, if we look back in history, just, back in the last gold era, I think, Bendigo had the largest stock exchange outside of London. So, if you think about what that sort of prosperity can sort of bring to a town, to a region, then, I think if we can spread that more broadly, that's only going to be beneficial. So it's pretty exciting what's happening here in Bendigo.
Okay, and I might just pass that on, Pat, because I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that too, about having a new gold rush is terrific for those people investing in gold mines shares, but as far as what I suppose good corporate citizen miners can do back to their communities, how do you see this gold rush actually impacting on Bendigo's community wealth?
Well, as Marnie says, I think it's a terrific opportunity for the region. The interesting thing about gold or any resource is, of course, it's in Bendigo, or it's near Bendigo. So it's not like some business attraction effort, where you're trying to attract footloose capital. A business can't make a decision to go and mine gold somewhere else. It's actually in Bendigo, so that gives the region, to my view, quite a bit of leverage in terms of the outcomes that it would expect from investors in the region. So, look, it's all the things we've been talking about. Bendigo and the region and the government should expect that there's social value creation out of new gold mining investment. It should be seeking to capture opportunities throughout the value chain for locals and for the region. So it's about playing hardball, but not being naive about it. It's actually being about smart. So local labour, investment in training, investment in community infrastructure, investment in tourism infrastructure, investment in the Indigenous community. So there's a real opportunity to build a community wealth as a result of that gold mining investment.
Tim, it would be a huge disruption, so I don't think it would ever happen to the same extent. But do you think that Australian governments should have been learning from the Norwegian model with North Sea oil, and that idea that, sure, businesses should make a nice profit out of what they're extracting from the ground, but there should be a real community benefit as well?
Yeah, apart from noticing that however innovative one is, one spouse can still fall over the computer lead and take your connection out, is what just happened. I think the lesson is not just to learn from the Norwegians, but to learn from what the British didn't do. And if you wondered why those northern cities are derelict and in bad shape, we didn't reinvest in them from the money that we got from the North Sea. We actually put it into property down south, is what we effectively did, through the devices of financial services going to London. So essentially, we must learn this lesson. And I think there's not a big picture thing. There's almost a small thing. In future, whatever opportunities come Bendigo way, the point is to leverage the hell out of them. But Pat was talking about some of that stuff, you know. So it's every transport investment is a jobs thing, is a way of getting the regional growth. Every educational opportunity is there are 5 things we can do whenever we build a station. It's a transit-oriented development. You know, we just need to use all these opportunities, but the best way to do that is the public-private collaboration around, you know, what outcomes do we want from Bendigo, and which bit are you going to do in private sector, which bit are you going to do in the public sector. That's the secret sauce going forward. And I'm sure you, people are looking in Australia because find it remarkable how well we've done in terms of the health outcomes. So they'll be looking at our model of development, and I think there will be new investment opportunities for Bendigo. But also, it's a lot easier to attract people to move to your city than industries to move to your city. So I think we can build new industries by attracting new people to Bendigo.
Tim, you've done a perfect segue to more of the questions that we've received. A lot of people are hitting the Ask a Question button on their screens, which is great. Dan's got an interesting one about the collaboration between private and public, and that is, how do we upskill local, state and federal government employees to better understand how to work with local business, rather than overwhelming local business with red tape, surveys and marketing approaches to actually get something done? Does our public sector need to grow up?
Far be from me to criticise them, although I have worked in governments for far too long. I think it's a moment of high reinvention of government, right? And so we are seeing governance barriers, governance and innovation and procurement barriers break down in housing and all that kind of stuff. So I think the issue is for the public sector to realise that things have fundamentally changed. They need to bend their rules or change their rules around procurement to allow local firms to win competitions and not to set too high barriers of entry to them, which only the big guys can win. Around Pat and I know there's public professional indemnity insurance and all sorts of things. I think it's a moment for public authorities in the region to realise what power they have to develop local markets. So instead of just think of themselves as buying services from the private sector, it's about developing local markets through their public procurement. And I think that one big cultural shift is what's required, not a bunch of Maoist re-education of public servants. It's just that, and politicians need to get off their back and to not criticise them when they make mistakes. You see, this is very fundamental, I think.
We've learned a lot. We've learned a lot through COVID, though, and if you have a look at how the federal government came together with this. Yeah. With the states. I mean, we've got an interesting model here in a federated model, and with the states in essence having more power than what the federal government has. But you saw everyone come together, and also come together with industry, with businesses, with regulators. During a time when we all knew that this was actually about trying to stimulate economic activity and trying to ensure, not only from a health crisis perspective, that everyone was safe and well, but that we're able to actually keep the economy going. And we've got to learn out of that, because there has been a lot of the red tape and I'll say even the green tape. There's been a lot of regulation that has been changed temporarily through this period of time, or waived or put to the side. And to actually just reinstate that is going to be the wrong thing to do. This is where we've learned, how to collaborate together, how to get actually the best outcomes for the economy, for individuals, for businesses. And we need to make sure that we actually do learn from this. And, I think if ever, this is the time that when we can make some substantial change, it's going to take away a lot of the impediments to being able to really prosper and grow as an economy.
So from the top down, Marnie, do you see that perhaps for the last 50 years we haven't necessarily been asking the right questions about what benefits this investment from private or public money will have on a community? It's not just about a shiny thing, it's about how that shiny thing and the money flows right through the community.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've gone into debt. I mean, you go back to January, the federal government was still talking about a surplus at that point in time. And very quickly we're now, have debt that's actually going to take a number of years for us to find our way through. So now it is about really conscious and smart spending. And this is where you get the collective minds together. And I don't mean the hierarchy together. You get it at a localised level. You get the grassroots, because people on the ground know what needs to be done. They know what will actually stimulate their particular communities, their particular economy. And that's what we should be doing, and being really smart about the investment that is now made.
Right. I'm just going to interject because Rod, Joe, Wayne and another Joe, thank you for your questions. I don't think we're going to get to those or another 20-odd questions as well. I believe you can follow those questions on your screen as you participate in the Bendigo Invention and Inventors Festival. But with about 4 minutes to go before we finish, let's get back to the full theme of, does Bendigo have an optimistic future? And I guess as Managing Director of Bendigo and Adelaide Bank, Marnie, would you like to summarise in 30 seconds or so for me what you see are the real advantages that we have for the next period of time?
I think going right back to what Tim said, the very first thing he said, this collaboration that we have in Bendigo, the fact that we can sit around, a table, have all parts of our community represented around that table, and having and be able to achieve some wonderful outcomes. We've got the infrastructure. There's more that can be done, but we've got all of the basic infrastructure to support a really thriving community into the future. So I'm really excited, and I'm really excited that I'm a part of it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Marnie. Tim, if you had to try and summarise the original premise in 30 or 40 seconds, what would you say?
Oh, look, I think Marnie said cities collaborate to compete, so that Bendigo can do that, can win that competition better than anywhere else. I think there's a question being asked about Danny Roderick's work around innovation. Bendigo can also lead, I think, on the innovation being inclusive. Inclusive innovation is something rarely achieved. I think we should really go for that. I think the last point is you better step up, because this is the moment. People have been talking about this kind of opportunity for regional cities for decades. This is the moment. If you miss this and fluff it, don't come asking.
Yep. That's actually really interesting, because I was thinking about how much of our conversation is about devolving skills that can be done anywhere back into regional centres. Suddenly our CBD, with a huge amount of financial interest from superannuation companies, corporations, property investors, is going to see a drain of their income. Are we going to be seeing a lobbying war about how or when we should be developing or supporting devolution of population and industry? Are we going to see a bit of a consultants' war happening in Canberra about which policies should be implemented for which vested interest?
I think that there's no question that there needs to be a balance with it. I think people were looking for a better balance between the kind of metropolitan growth and the regional cities, and we weren't able to get there. So this is a moment where that's going to be reset. But nobody benefits from a collapsed CBD in Melbourne, right? Nobody benefits from that. So it's about a managed transition, I think, or over the next 5 or 10 years, frankly. But there will be immediately this thing about this. There will be immediately this thing about, you've got people working who might want to work in Bendigo 2-3 days a week and then have to go into the Melbourne office for the rest. That, I think, is a real shift. That's, you need to cater for that. So I think there's a benign possibility of a stronger Bendigo and a changed Melbourne. But nobody wants the metropolitan cities to collapse, as it were, right? So I don't think it's either or. But I do think it's a moment for the regional cities to put their hands up and to legitimately be invested in, because I think people are, there's a public appetite for that, and there's an economic rationality for it.
Excellent. Tim, sorry, Marnie, you've got 20 seconds.
Sorry. It's not about decentralisation, it's about regionalisation. So it's actually not about taking away, it's about actually elevating a regionalisation. And, there is a lot of companies that have gone offshore that now are actually thinking about an onshoring, so Australian companies, and whether that's call centres or distribution hubs or any sort of infrastructure, think about actually housing that, in the regions. And migration that automatically goes to Sydney or Melbourne.
I'm about to
migration.
Excellent, Marty, thank you. And Pat, I'm going to come to you just for one last moment, and that is for you to summarise our conversation, any salient point that you really think we should be taking home.
I can just hear your question, Jonathan. Only to say Bendigo's advantage is, as we've described it, its history, its authenticity, its manufacturing, its gold, its livability, its community, and that last one is really important, that the community is sustained and it'll form the basis of a successful economy going forward.
All three of you, thank you so much for joining us at the first session of the Bendigo Invention and Innovation Festival.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we've been speaking with Marnie Baker, the Managing Director of Bendigo and Adelaide Bank, Pat Fensham from SGS Economics and Planning, and Tim Williams from Arup. And thank you for joining us for the Bendigo Innovation Festival as well. What I would like to say again is thank you to our sponsor ASQ and our contributors, the Bendigo and Adelaide Bank. Now let's talk to somebody who I think could be introduced as a perpetual optimist. The Bendigo Invention and Invention Festival is celebrating its 10th year, and innovation through optimism is what we're talking about. We'll have some questions for Victor at the end of this presentation, and so will you. So don't forget to use that Ask button, and don't forget that we'd love to hear from you on Twitter as well, and other platforms. Our hashtag today is hashtag 2020BIIF, hashtag 2020 BIIF. Now, the session's contributor for the next hour or so is the Centre for Optimism. And our keynote speaker is the founder, Chief Executive Officer, Chief Cook and Bottle Washer, and most importantly, the Centre for Optimism's Chief Optimism Officer. So there aren't too many organisations with one of those jobs around the globe. So with the Centre of Optimism, Victor Perton, thank you and welcome.
Jonathan, it's such a pleasure, and my heart is full. You know, listening to Yala Pulford, to Paul Chapman, to Marnie, to Tim, and to Paul, and to you. I mean, it just demonstrates the underpinning of the Bendigo economy, which is optimism, right back to the gold mining days and thousands of years before that of innovation and optimism from our Indigenous brothers and sisters.
Absolutely. However, Victor, your life path, I'm surprised you're still an optimist. You went through law and politics, but you've come out the end still a complete optimist. What's your recipe?
Well, of course, my personal recipe is every morning I publish several answers to the question, what makes you optimistic? So I'd like everyone to remember that question. Not are you optimistic, what makes you optimistic? And think about your answer, and tonight or today, ask your spouse, ask a workmate, ask a friend that question, what makes you optimistic? And that fills me full of joy every day. But my pathway was a surprising one, Jonathan.
Before we do that, can I just flog your poll a little bit more, just to make sure people understand? On their screens, I think, we will be seeing a what makes you optimistic question coming up. There'll be 6 options for you to choose from. There'll be life experience, mindset, family and friends, faith, meditation or prayer, or simply gratitude and smiling and laughing. So please, we'd love to get as many people to bring it through that poll and let us know what makes you optimistic. And what I'm optimistic about is how easy the technology is to use. Just click the button and you're on the way. So now that we've got that poll underway, and we'll ask you to click again soon, I'd like to return to you, Victor, and please do continue with your story. Thank you.
Well, the story is that I'd had the opportunity to work in the United States and South America, and then on the G20 presidency. And everywhere I went, my work was made easy because I was an Australian, and there was this very positive stereotype of Australians. And then I came back to Melbourne in 2015 and was astonished by the negativity. To cut a long story short, we interviewed 2,500 people on the qualities of Australian leadership, and you exemplify them as speakers have exemplified them. Egalitarianism, you know, our Prime Minister drives in the front seat of the car, not the back seat. We treat our cleaner with the same respect that we treat the chairman. Self-effacing humour and no bullshit plain speaking. So we've got millions of people like that, and that's why Bendigo's thriving, why the country has thrived. And my eureka moment came in late 2017. There wasn't much wrong with the leadership. The problem is we're caught up in a fog of pessimism. And that's why my passion now is to help people unlock their own optimism. And my mother, who is 92, who has fostered me through my university, my law career, supported me in politics and everything else I've done, my mum says, I've never done more important work than asking people what makes you optimistic. And presidents and prime ministers are one group of people you can ask, but when you do it in a remote Indian village of women digging ditches and you ask them what makes them optimistic, their faces light up as they share their answers with you. We've decided not to do a PowerPoint presentation. I have 105 PowerPoint slides, so if anyone wants them, you can email me at victorperton@gmail.com and I'll send it to you. But we thought better a conversation, cut my speech a little bit shorter and have more time for all those questions that are coming through. So let's start with a real example of optimism. Lots of conferences and festivals around the world have shut down, Jonathan, and given up, but not the Bendigo Invention and Innovation Festival. And what's the result? We've got 7 times the number of registrations. I've seen them online, you've seen them online. We have people from Denver, San Diego, hundreds of people from Bendigo, from Asia, from Africa and Europe joining in on this. So what a statement of success for Margaret O'Rourke and Paul Chapman that they said, let's carry on, and 7 times the people have supported them. And if your viewers and your listeners can conjure up the notion of a witch's cauldron of ideas, what is the thing that has made Bendigo bubble over? It's that dose of optimism that Yala Pulford talked about. Now, let me give you another example. I interviewed the mayor, Margaret O'Rourke, and her friend Mary Dwyer 3 weeks ago for the Bendigo Voices of Optimism. And out of that, I cut 30 seconds of video. And we placed that on LinkedIn. Would you believe, Jonathan, that we then had dozens of people sharing their stories of moving to Bendigo with their family from Adelaide, from New Zealand and elsewhere. And the common theme was optimism, their personal optimism and the optimism of the community of Bendigo. As I was preparing for the Voices of Optimism this festival, I looked at the website of the Bendigo Senior Secondary High School. Do you know what their central ethic is? Optimism. So no wonder we have hundreds of graduates of that school spreading out through Bendigo and beyond, spreading the message of optimism. And it's why the city thrives not just in economy, but in the arts and culture, even United Nations listed as a city of gastronomy. Spirituality, you and I talked about it before the start of today. A friend of mine, Bishop Philip Huggins, is the head of the Australian Council of Churches. And I said, look, would you share a quote with me for Bendigo? He said, with pleasure, Victor. I was ordained in Bendigo and my great-grandfather was a miner in Bendigo. So he was able to call to mind 4 generations of optimism through Bendigo. But that's enough about my enthusiasm for Bendigo. The promise was that optimism is your superpower in business and in life. And would you believe that when I opened my clippings this morning at 5 a.m, I got up early, I was excited about this event, Indrani Sen had published an editorial entitled Optimism is Your Superpower. I mean, what a sign. So for everyone watching, we're not using the PowerPoint. You're welcome to the 105 PowerPoint slides. I want you to remember 3 things. This first exercise will require you to shout at me. I know I won't hear you over the web, but the first thing I want you to remember is the leader is the person in my mirror. The leader is the person in my mirror. And if you use red lipstick, or if you don't use red lipstick, borrow it, go to your mirror. You can go now or you can go at the end of the speech and write on your mirror, the leader is the person in my mirror. The second thing I want you to remember is surround yourself with optimists. When you're choosing people to have coffee with, when you're choosing people to be around your board table, choose optimists. As one Australian billionaire said to me, I only have optimists around my board table. I can hire the pessimists by the hour from law firms and accounting firms and auditing firms. So surround yourself with optimists. And when I asked Bill George, the famous Harvard professor on leadership, I said, what makes you optimistic, Bill? Bill looked and said, being surrounded by positive people. What a blessing. So if it's good enough for the author of True North, it's good enough for you. And the third thing is this question, which you can see on the poster behind me, what makes you optimistic? I want you to try it out at your next exec team, your next sales team. Don't do it every week. Don't do it every day. But once a month or once a quarter, make that the question. Nothing drives me crazier, Jonathan, than hearing a chairman of a board say, oh, well, would you share what keeps you awake at night? Nothing should keep you awake at night with the power of optimism and the power of positive thinking. Now, I'm going to go through several reasons why you should be optimistic for health and business, and then I'm going to share a few of the habits that you can adopt that will give you that superpower. Now, the first reason for optimism is your health. Last year, in a huge study, Boston University, Harvard University, and the American military published a study on longevity, on people living healthily and well beyond the age of 85. To their surprise, it wasn't geography, it wasn't genetics, it wasn't wealth. It was the trait of optimism. And this backed up a study by the American College of Cardiology and the Mount Sinai Medical System. Huge studies of studies, several 100,000 people over 40 and 50 years. The most protective trait against heart disease and the greatest predictor of recovery from heart disease is the trait of optimism. And it completely surprised and confounded the head researchers in two of these studies. And it appears that there are similar facts in relation to cancer, similar facts in relation to dementia, but I'd put the strong case to you, and there's lots of scientific material for it, that optimism is good for your health. Now, and a really interesting study, which makes most of us smile and laugh, was a study from the University of Michigan on the impact of having an optimistic spouse or partner. It appears that if you have an optimistic spouse or partner, it gives you some of the same protective benefits as being optimistic yourself. So for those of you who are single, whether the first time round or the second time round, I suggest that in that first date, ask someone, what makes you optimistic? Whatever way you want to test that. And if, of course, you're married to a pessimist, there are two conclusions, and I hope that you adopt the one that helps them to become more optimistic. Now, in business, and part of the reason Jonathan's excellent question on how did I go down this pathway, the head of McKinsey, Dominic Barton, said to me, you can talk about 50, 60, 70 qualities of the leader, but all the great leaders are infectiously optimistic. It's not the rah-rah speech from the front, it's the person who can unlock the optimism from the team. And you'd all know Jeremy Johnson, the former head of the Australian Chamber of Commerce, the guy that really made Sovereign Hill a success, a chairman of local water authorities. Funny enough, when I interviewed him several years before that, when I went back and looked at the interview, exactly the same thing as Dominic Barton. And Iger, who's just retired as the head of Disney, has written a book on leadership, 10 qualities of leadership. Have a guess what the top one is. Infectious optimism. Now, if you're in business, in education, anything else, strategy has to be at the forefront, at least on a weekly basis. We did a study, the Centre for Optimism, interviewed 400 strategy leaders around the world. 90% of them said that optimism should be at the core of strategy. 60% of them thought they had taken part in an optimistic strategy. But here's an opportunity for you all. Only 20% were measuring optimism in workers, stakeholders, customers. So I think you all know the maxim, what you don't measure, you don't know. So strategy has to be optimistic. The other thing that governments and business talk about time and time again is resilience. Now, I want to ask yourself the question. I'll pause. How can you be resilient unless you believe there will be a better future? That persisting will lead you to be better. And Professor Jane Burns, who headed up the Young and Well CRC, put it really well to me. I don't have the quote directly in front of me, but she basically said, people talk about resilience, they talk about tenacity, but when the time comes, you know, when it's between giving up and going on, she says it's optimism that's at the core. And then innovation. This is the core of this festival, and I'll just read you a couple of the contributions that people have given me over the years. And Paul Chapman, the chair of the Bendigo Invention and Innovation Festival, said to me, every innovator, inventor and change leader inherently use optimism as their energy and sustenance. It is the never-ending supply of fuel in the tank that allows them to persevere and succeed. And Simon Edgerton, the head of computer science at Bendigo La Trobe, said, be optimistic. It frees the mind and nourishes the soul of innovation. And Martin Parkinson, who you will all know as the former head of the Australian Public Service, said, optimism drives curiosity, which in turn fosters innovation and invention. So whatever the challenges we face, it's better to tackle them with an optimistic bent, confident that nothing is insurmountable, given enough will and effort. Now, I could give you 100 quotes on entrepreneurship and the like, but I think the case is made, particularly in Australia, where we're suffering from COVID, where we've had a doubling in the number of people who are taking medication for anxiety and depression. The time has come for each and every one of you, like Yala this morning, like Margaret, like Paul, like Marnie, like Tim and Paul and Jonathan himself. The time has come for you to be a beacon of optimism. So, what are the habits that you can adopt to make that happen? Number one was something we were talking about with our pre-preparation, and that's the value of smile. Now, you know it, right? Smiling is crucially important, but it's so easy to forget when we wake up a little grumpy in the morning or the teenagers are grumping at you. Start the day with a smile. Start the day when you go for your walk, smiling at strangers, greeting strangers. It may sound astonishingly simple, but if you actually keep it at the forefront of your mind, morning, during the day and evening, and if you urge that upon your frontline staff, whether it's the receptionist or the salesperson, to remember to smile, to remember to curl the edges of your mouth up. And then attached to that is the habit of laughter. Telling a joke, finding something funny in an expression that a colleague has made, finding something funny on a radio broadcast, laughing is a central part of it. And if you haven't got it in your diary already, you know, once a week, just read a page of jokes or a page of humour, and, you know, that will just help you so much. Last week, I did an interview on New Zealand radio, and the compere said, ladies and gentlemen, I've been shamelessly plagiarising this man, Victor Perton, for the last year. And I looked quizzically, well, we were on the air, but what he had adopted were my changes to the way you greet people. So smiling is number one, greeting is number two. So what happens in Australia when you say, g'day, how are you?
You say good.
No. 65% of people, Jonathan, say not bad or not too bad. What a wasted question. What a wasted answer. So a habit I'd like you to try for the rest of the day, and you can get a refund on my speech if it doesn't work. You might even try it for the rest of the week, is what's the best thing happening for you? Or what's the best thing in your day? Just try it. So g'day X, what's the best thing in your day? Or what's going well for you will change the tenor of the conversation. And the flip side of that I'd like you to try is if someone says, how are you? Instead of, as Jonathan just did, good or terrific or whatever, which actually doesn't sound that sincere in the Australian mindset, pause. So thanks for asking. Oh, God, I was at an interesting event this morning, or, the kids made me coffee this morning, or just something that will start a conversation on a positive mindset. Now, the third habit that I'd like you to adopt is turn down the news. Right? There is nothing more designed to make you depressed and anxious than the news service in Australia and wherever else you are. People have redefined news as bad. So instead of listening to the news several times a day, for the average executive, 15 minutes in the morning, 15 minutes in the evening, and don't start till you're driving into work. Bad news can catch up to you pretty quickly, but try and start with something bright and cheerful and positive every day. I've got a couple of minutes left, so I'll just race through these last 4 habits that I'd like you to adopt. The next one is to meditate. Now, meditation, prayer, however you like to define it, the science says that if you meditate 5 or 6 minutes a day, hopefully several times a week, but even a couple of times a week would be enough, the science says that your brain actually thickens at the frontal portion, which is where happiness, joy comes from. We've got a number of meditations for optimism on our website, and there'll actually be some meditation sessions during the course of this festival. The next one is a gratitude journal. Many of you will have heard about this. Keeping a book by your bed or a piece of paper by your bed, and at the end of the day, writing down the 3 best things that happened to you. Some people do it by doing it at dinner with their kids. The important trick, the science says, is make that the first thing you read in the morning. So take that piece of paper, take that journal, whether you're sitting on the toilet or having a cup of coffee first thing, read what happened yesterday. It's better than medication. Daydreaming is crucially important. Dream where you're going to be in 5 years, dream where you're going to be in 1 year. The American military now uses this as a regular exercise. Take a piece of paper for 15 minutes and write down where you're going to be in 6 months, 1 year, 5 years, your best possible self. There's more material on this, our Habits of the Optimism, on our website at the Centre for Optimism, and I'm racing a little bit so we can get to questions. So what makes you optimistic? Well, we've asked nearly 10,000 people this question now. My favourite quote comes from Professor G, who is a neuroscientist at the University of Melbourne. And she says, optimism is the evidence of dreams not yet realised. So think about that. Optimism is the evidence of your dreams not yet realised. So I'd hope if when you go away today, remember the 3 things I've asked of you. In lipstick on your mirror, write down the leader looks like the person in my mirror. And hopefully do that on a public mirror that all of your colleagues share. Secondly, surround yourself with optimists. Attend all of the sessions that you can at the Bendigo Invention and Innovation Festival. And the last thing, whether it's once a month or once a quarter, round your board table, round your exec table, go round the table, and it's not about work, it's about what motivates people. Ask them, what makes you optimistic? Jonathan, that's enough from me speaking. I think it'd be much more fun now to engage in conversation and answering questions.
Victor, thank you very much. I must say that you exude optimism and energy like a very good light bulb. So it's been terrific sitting here absorbing. Thank you.
So one thing, Jonathan, we've got another poll for everyone, but the first time we only gave them choices.
Yep.
The second Slido poll, we'd like them to type in a word, a sentence, or even a paragraph on what makes you optimistic.
So tell us in your own words what makes you optimistic. That poll should be turning up on the right-hand side of your screens as we speak. And this is the chance to go free for. So yeah, it's always, as you say, nice to be able to put one of 5 or 6 choices down, but this time it's really important. Do you know, interestingly, in our survey, I didn't get the exact percentages. I was too busy writing notes on what you were saying, Victor. But the biggest thing that people practiced for optimism was a mindset. And interestingly to me, the least popular answer was the mindfulness, the meditation one. So does that surprise you? What sort of trends do you normally get when you ask that poll?
The biggest one we've done, which was several thousand people, was life experience.
Life experience.
There's actually scientific evidence, Jonathan, that says we don't hit peak optimism till we're in our 60s. When you can put the normal anxieties of life, the broken romances, the failed contract, the mistake in design, you put it down into the circumstances of a whole life. So normally life experience is number one, mindset is pretty high up, faith is pretty high up. But in Australia, we're not a particularly spiritual people. So meditation and prayer probably figures less than it does in my interviews in India or Asia or Africa.
Okay, well, we'd really love people to fill this out. In your own words, what makes you optimistic? The first three answers through Victor are interesting people. The second one is altruism, humour and love. All will turn out well. And the third is the next generation, our children. So in some ways, you're unsurprised by those first three straight off, cabs off the rank?
Well, that second one, there's an English mystic, Mother Julian of Norwich, who actually 700 years ago lived through the Black Death and persecutions. And hers is the oldest book in English written by a woman, surviving book written by a woman. And her famous phrase, quoted by popes and Anglican archbishops and others, is, "All shall be well, all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well." So 700 years of wisdom there.
Excellent. I'm interested too, because you touched on the idea of where optimism fits in with resilience. And in some ways, are you seeing a cultural change in the last, say, 10 years? There was a time when mindfulness, for example, as a word was seen as way out there, and now it's quite regularly used. And then the buzzword, particularly in education, is building resilient children and resilient communities. Do you think it's only a small step to where we will be saying our priority is building optimistic children or optimistic communities?
Look, it's vital. And I'm working on another project called the Nelson Mandela Youth Leadership Summit. And like the Bendigo Invention and Innovation Festival, they've adopted a slogan which is young people leading with optimism through the pandemic and beyond. So take the first step, mindfulness and meditation. It's certainly appearing in the schools and becoming more widespread, but it's still a minority, but it's in fact, Catalyst, the Australian ABC TV program, actually did a study of the impact of meditation on the frontal portion of the brain using MRIs to measure it, and were actually able to obtain measurable changes in the brain after 6 weeks. The one that frustrates me, Jonathan, is the persistent notion of coaching for resilience without coaching for optimism. So as if somehow you become resilient without the underpinning. And same with innovation. So if anyone's watching the show who's in recruitment or leadership in a company, the thing I find bizarre in Australia is the absence of the conversation on optimism. I asked an Australian ambassador, I won't say what country it is, but she said to me, "Look, I'm in my 50s, Victor. You are the first person ever to raise optimism." So I'm bewildered how recruitment firms and the like can ask you, "Oh, are you innovative?" or "Can you be innovative?" And as Tim said earlier, all of us are called upon to be innovative now. But the science says you can't be innovative or resilient without optimism. So in the case of innovation, Dyson is said to have had 5,000 iterations of his vacuum cleaner before he had a commercial model. Edison was the same. The fundamental of being an optimist is, if I may swear, shit happens. Your first experiment, your first innovation may go wrong, and you've got to keep going. Whereas the pessimist is ground down in, "Oh, whose fault is it? It's your fault," or the but. The but person, Jonathan, the person around the table who's just leaning forward to say but to your proposal. I'd love everyone. One of our habits that we recommend is to be an and person rather than a but person.
Interesting stuff indeed. Is it as simple as from little things, big things grow? If we can develop a classroom of optimists or a workplace of optimists, does that naturally percolate upwards to our leaders? Or is there something that our leaders need to develop as they become optimistic as well to make sure that it is a community-wide philosophy?
It's come back to Dominic Barton at McKinsey, who said, "Look, it's not the guy that does the rah-rah speech at the front. It's the person who can unlock it from the bottom." And I gave a presentation at an ASX top 5 company. And I was at the end of the day, the CEO was at the beginning of the day. The interesting criticism, positive criticism of the workforce who attended the workshop was we should have done the optimism first and the CEO at the end, so you can frame the CEO's challenges in a flavour of optimism. It becomes so infectious. I did an event in Sydney, and with this Slido, there were a group of Kiwis from the Kiwi Tax Department who manipulated it and made gin the biggest cause of optimism. Then they asked me to come over and do a presentation. Well, in fact, both workshops were sold out with people from the tax department, and my friends in New Zealand all hate me because I think they rather wanted a depressed and anxious tax department rather than an optimistic and effective tax department. But it created just this whole notion. So, one woman got up and said, look, my husband was cleared of bowel cancer on Friday, and it was our faith and optimism that got us through. And so we built this self-sustaining group of optimists. We've done the same in Dementia Australia. And so everyone online, all you need to do is get a gathering of your workers and a fairly simple and slow process of asking each of them to share their optimism not just in work, optimism in life. I did the same thing in prisons. And a very serious criminal also shared his story of recovery from cancer with optimism as the underpinning. It brought the man next to him, a man with arms and tats, thicker than my waist, and that's pretty thick, brought him to emotional tears. So it's a great exercise to do together, to find what makes you optimistic and then to make that an infectious process in your company or your community. And as I said, when I talked to the principal of Bendigo Senior Secondary College, he's extremely proud of that value of optimism and the impact it's had in that school community.
Okay, I'm going to read out a couple more of the what makes you optimists, and then we better go to other people's questions because I've been monopolising the conversation. Victor Perton's our guest from the Centre for Optimism. What makes you optimistic? Let's see, people's adaptability amongst many other things, family and friends and living in beautiful Bendigo, contributing to positive change for others, so knowing you have an effect on other people, interesting. The fact that we can all be protagonists and co-creators of our world. And what makes me optimistic? Self-awareness of being optimistic and seeking like-minded people to engage with. So they're just a handful of the answers that your first survey had, Victor. And very interesting indeed. Let's go through some more. Creativity, makers and artists. People's adaptability, I think we've touched on as well. And we'll go to the questions now. It might not be too late to throw in a question if you would like to. Simply use the Ask the Question facility to the right-hand side of your screens and we'll see what you get. While we're waiting for the technology to kick in, I just wonder, optimism versus blind optimism, Victor?
We foster realistic and infectiously optimistic leadership. And Mick Farrell, I think you know the company ResMed. Actually, you can prompt me on this, Jonathan. What's ResMed make?
I don't know.
Huge company that is the biggest marriage-saving company on earth.
Really?
They make CPAP machines. The machines that stop men and women snoring.
Oh, yes.
And it's grown from a seed company of $1 million in Australia to a company I think that is now valued at $25 billion. And Mick Farrell, the CEO, said to me, look, you can't run a medtech company without being optimistic. And it's an optimism grounded in reality. A good strategy, a good business plan, a good ownership plan. But that's life, right? Because the definition, and maybe I should have done this at the beginning, but it's good that you prompted me, Jonathan. Optimism is not a silver lining in every dark cloud. Bad things happen to people. It's not Pollyannaism. The best definition of optimism is the one used by Harvard, Stanford, Oxford, the US military, and that is optimism is a belief that things will work out in the end. To which some people add, and if it hasn't worked out, it's not the end. So optimism really underpins resilience because it's this belief that things will work out in the end. And generally they do.
They do. Carolyn's got the hard question, I suppose. How do people generate your superpower of optimism when you don't feel optimistic, when in fact all they feel is down or afraid? That is, of course, the hard one, isn't it?
It is, and in fact, yesterday when we launched the Optimist Heart, one of the pleas from one of the participants to me was that my mother is killing herself with her pessimism. What can I do to help her? So, in fact, I've given her free membership of the centre and the tools and the like, and we may end up having a positive. It's the first tool is stop listening to the news. I know, Jonathan, in your business, that's a bad thing for me to say, but if you listen to the radio news at 6 a.m, you wouldn't get out of bed. So number one trick is to do that. Number two trick is to actually start sharing stories of hope and optimism. So that, I could go back through the habits, and we're actually going to develop worldwide free course, Jonathan, on the habits of the optimist. But the other suggestion I have for our listener is just start that little habit of, instead of how are you, what's the best thing happening? Or what's the best thing in your day? Just whatever comes natural to you, try it for a day, try it for the rest of the week, and come back to me at the end of the week. My email is victorperton@gmail.com, and I'd welcome helping you and talking to you directly. But I think if you try those two little things, the news 15 minutes a day max, but also that hunting the little stories of hope and optimism. And Jonathan, one of the things, this is very much a business conference as well as a community conference. The big brands like Coca-Cola and Disney have their marketing people now say people are yearning for stories of hope and optimism.
Excellent.
So each of us can do that.
So, Joe, I'm going to take your question as a comment, which is, don't sabotage yourself by unwittingly adopting negative, unproductive attitudes through your associations with others. And with 60 seconds left on the clock, Victor, can you tell the audience of the Dalai Lama's response to the question, why do you choose optimism over pessimism?
Choose optimism, it feels better. And that's the Dalai Lama.
It feels better. Simple as that. Victor Perton, we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining us with what has become your life's work with the Centre for Optimism. It's been very enlightening and very optimistic talking to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I'm so happy that Bendigo and the Bendigo Invention and Innovation Festival have increased their audience sevenfold, with optimism as the secret ingredient.
It is the secret ingredient indeed. Well, this is the start of many inspirational sessions within the Bendigo Invention and Innovation Festival. And don't forget, access all of what we're doing on the 2020 BIIF app through your browser or your mobile device to add more free sessions and make that percentage climb even more. Further details can be found at biif.com.au. There are 2 more sessions today. In 2 hours from now, we'll be exploring an optimistic question, the sky's the limit, or is it? And in 4 hours from now, a conversation looking at a fundamental in innovation and optimism, creativity and communication in science. As usual, all details are on the Bendigo Invention and Innovation Festival webpage and app. Well, that's a wrap for this morning's session. Thank you very much for joining us, and goodbye.